People in South Florida have started their spring cleaning a little early this year by rounding up green iguanas in their gardens and on sidewalks and streets.
Something strange is happening across South Florida. In neighborhoods that were once overrun with large, prehistoric-looking lizards sunning themselves on seawalls and canal banks, the numbers seem to shift without warning. Wildlife officials have counted populations in the hundreds of thousands, some estimates pushing past 1 million. And yet, in certain corridors and communities, iguanas vanish in waves, only to surge back months later with seemingly no explanation. People assume it must be some ambitious predator finally doing the job. Hawk maybe, python, or perhaps the removal crews working overtime. The truth is far stranger, and far more humbling than any of that. The green iguana arrived in South Florida not through any natural migration but through human carelessness, escaped pets, deliberate releases, and the gradual collapse of whatever containment people imagined existed. By the time wildlife officials began formally tracking the population in the early 2000s, the species had already embedded itself so thoroughly into the landscape that eradication was no longer a realistic conversation. What replaced that conversation was something more uncomfortable: adaptation, management, and the slow admission that an ecosystem had been fundamentally altered. To understand why iguanas are disappearing from certain zones, and why that disappearance is so temporary, you have to first understand how completely this species rewrote the rules of survival in a place it was never supposed to exist. Green iguanas are not passive inhabitants. They are ecosystem engineers in the worst possible sense for everything else living around them. Along canal banks from Palm Beach County to Miami-Dade, they dig. The burrowing is relentless and structurally significant, carving tunnels into the soft, water-saturated soils that line South Florida's vast drainage infrastructure. Engineers and hydrologists who study the region's water management systems have noted that the damage doesn't announce itself dramatically. Instead, it builds invisibly beneath the surface. Voids form under concrete walkways. Compaction shifts. Embankments that have held for decades begin to show stress fractures that accelerate during storm surges. The iguana isn't destroying Florida's infrastructure in a single season. It is weakening it year by year, one burrow at a time. Above ground, the feeding pressure is equally methodical. Green iguanas are herbivores with broad tastes, and a particular fondness for the kinds of ornamental vegetation that defines South Florida's landscaped neighborhoods. Hibiscus, bougainvillea, citrus seedlings, and coastal native shrubs are consumed with such consistency that in monitored ecological plots, native plant regeneration has measurably declined over time. The plants that would naturally replenish a coastal corridor are stripped before they can reach reproductive maturity. No single iguana causes a detectable shift in plant community structure. But tens of thousands of them, feeding across the same landscape for years, reshape the botanical architecture of entire stretches of shoreline and parkland. The ecosystem doesn't collapse. It quietly becomes something different, something less diverse, less resilient, and less able to support the native species that evolved within it. The health dimension adds another layer to an already complicated picture. Green iguanas carry Salmonella bacteria as a routine part of their biology. Both wild and captive populations test positive with regularity, and while direct transmission events to humans are not common, the urban context in which iguanas now live dramatically increases the exposure surface. These animals traverse pool decks, docks, patios, and children's play areas. In densely populated communities across Broward County, public health advisories reminding residents to practice hygiene precautions after iguana contact have become a normalized feature of summer. The concern isn't a mass outbreak. It's the steady, low-level contamination risk that comes with sharing your backyard with a wild reptile that sheds bacteria wherever it walks. By the late 2010s, wildlife managers had shifted their language in a telling way. They stopped talking about iguanas as a species spreading across a landscape and started describing them as a structural load on the ecosystem. That framing matters. A structural load is something you manage, not something you eliminate. It is a force you account for, redistribute, and relieve where possible, knowing it will never fully disappear. That shift in perspective set the stage for Florida's most significant policy decision on the iguana question. In 2019, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission formally removed green iguanas from their protected species designation. On private land, residents could now kill them year-round without a permit. The policy was designed to do what decades of informal discouragement had failed to accomplish: create enough distributed pressure on the population to suppress it meaningfully across a broad area. What followed was the rapid growth of a professional removal industry. Contractors offering targeted culling services multiplied across South Florida, setting their rates between $50 and $150 per animal depending on access and density. In the most heavily colonized zones along canal-heavy suburbs, single coordinated efforts pulled hundreds of animals from one property. Statewide, annual removal numbers climbed into the tens of thousands, generating the appearance of serious, sustained control. But the structure beneath those numbers told a different story. Removal efforts were driven almost entirely by private demand. A homeowner or golf course manager would hire a contractor, clear their property, and consider the problem solved. Meanwhile, the adjacent neighborhood, the drainage corridor 2 streets over, or the park buffer at the edge of the development remained completely unmanaged. Iguanas didn't disappear from those places. They simply waited or moved slightly, and then refilled the cleared zone within weeks. The landscape these animals navigate is defined by an interconnected network of canals, drainage channels, and linear greenways that function like highways for a species that is comfortable in water and highly mobile on land. Removing iguanas from one node of that network without addressing the surrounding nodes produces localized, short-term relief, not population suppression. Reproductive numbers make that problem nearly impossible to overcome through culling alone. A female green iguana in Florida's climate doesn't lay a handful of eggs. She lays between 20 and 70 per clutch, and she is capable of producing more than one clutch in a warm year. Population biologists modeling these dynamics reach the same conclusion regardless of which approach they take. Even under conditions of elevated mortality, the volume of new animals entering the population through reproduction rapidly restores density toward equilibrium. A removal campaign that takes 1,000 animals out of a given area over 3 months may be offset within a single breeding cycle. The population doesn't collapse. It absorbs the pressure and refills. There is also a spatial dynamic that ecologists call source sink structure, and it is fundamental to understanding why localized success so rarely translates into regional control. The areas receiving the most intensive removal pressure, dense suburban zones, high-value properties along waterways, become temporary sinks, places where iguanas are removed faster than they can reproduce locally. But surrounding them, in the parks and unmanaged greenways and less affluent neighborhoods that don't hire removal contractors, source populations continue reproducing at full capacity and continuously push new individuals into the cleared zones. The sink never stays empty. The source never stops producing. No amount of individual removal effort breaks that cycle as long as the source populations remain untouched. Cold weather has occasionally provided what human effort couldn't: dramatic, visible population crashes that spread across news coverage and wildlife reports alike. When an unusual cold front pushes temperatures near or below 10 degrees Celsius across South Florida, the physiology of an ectothermic reptile becomes its greatest vulnerability. Muscle function slows to near paralysis. Gripping ability disappears. Iguanas simply fall from trees, landing on sidewalks and fences in states that look, to an uninformed observer, indistinguishable from death. During significant cold events, these mass immobilization episodes result in genuine die-offs across Miami-Dade County and surrounding regions. The numbers can be striking. The imagery is unforgettable. And the population rebound, in the warm months that follow, is equally dramatic. Cold events interrupt the population. They do not suppress it. The animals that survive reproduce into a landscape with temporarily reduced competition and respond with precisely the kind of accelerated output that biology is designed to produce in exactly those conditions. Now, here is where the real story of Florida's disappearing iguanas begins to take shape. Because the most significant forces acting on this population are not what most people picture when they imagine a predator. The creatures removing iguanas most effectively from Florida's landscape are not panthers, not pythons, not hawks circling in the afternoon thermals. The most consequential predator in this system operates at night, at ground level, and it is not after the iguanas themselves. It is after their eggs. Raccoons have quietly become one of the most effective biological checks on iguana population growth in South Florida, and they accomplish this without ever confronting a full-grown lizard. Female green iguanas nest in predictable locations, loose, sandy substrates near water, the kind of disturbed soil produced by canal construction and residential landscaping projects. They select these sites based on temperature, drainage, and exposure, and the nesting behavior follows consistent seasonal timing. Raccoons have learned to read all of those cues. Moving through canal margins at night, they locate freshly turned soil using olfactory detection sharp enough to identify the faint biological traces left during egg deposition. Once a nest is found, the excavation takes minutes. A single raccoon can destroy an entire clutch, potentially 70 eggs, in a single night's work. Field experiments that restricted raccoon access to iguana nesting sites produced results that were striking in their clarity. When raccoons were excluded, hatchling survival rates in monitored plots doubled or tripled within one breeding season. That's not a marginal effect. That is a fundamental regulatory mechanism operating quietly beneath the surface of a visible population problem. Raccoons aren't charismatic in the way that a panther or a hawk commands attention, but in the context of this particular ecological equation, they are performing the most essential work. Feral cats and free-ranging dogs occupy a different layer of the same pressure system. They don't excavate nests. Their role begins at the moment of emergence, when hatchlings surface from the soil after roughly 90 days of incubation and begin dispersing across open ground in search of cover. A hatchling iguana is under 20 centimeters long, moving quickly across terrain with minimal refuge, and highly visible to a visual predator built for exactly that kind of pursuit. Cats intercept them with consistency in the suburban neighborhoods of Broward County, where ornamental lawns leave little room for a small reptile to disappear into cover. The cumulative effect of feline predation across densely populated neighborhoods during peak hatching periods is significant, even if each individual event looks like nothing more than a house cat being a house cat. Above all of this operates the great horned owl, the one aerial predator that consistently takes iguanas across South Florida's canal-lined suburbs. This bird hunts in silence, with a wingspan approaching 1.5 meters and talons capable of exerting force comparable to a medium-sized mammal. Its sensory precision is extraordinary. Asymmetrical ear placement allows it to triangulate sound with enough accuracy to strike in near total darkness based on the sound of movement alone. It doesn't need to see the iguana. It needs to hear it shift position in a tree as temperatures drop after sunset. Juvenile iguanas are most exposed during exactly this window, when they move from daytime basking sites toward overnight roosts, and their cold-slowed reflexes make evasion difficult. The owl drops rather than chases. The strike is over before the prey registers the threat. What emerges from all of this is a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of a state losing control of an invasive species. Florida's iguanas are not disappearing because some apex predator has finally stepped in to restore balance. They are being held in a dynamic tension by a dispersed, layered system of mortality pressures, cold events, nest predation, juvenile attrition, fragmented removal programs, and the slow structural resistance of an ecosystem that is being redesigned piece by piece to be slightly less welcoming. None of these forces is sufficient on its own. All of them together are insufficient to reverse the invasion. But they create something, an ongoing biological negotiation between a species with extraordinary reproductive resilience and an environment that is actively pushing back through every mechanism available to it. The scientific consensus that has emerged from Florida's wildlife management agencies and university research programs is consistent on one point. Eradication is not a realistic goal. The population is too large, too geographically distributed, too reproductively powerful, and too behaviorally flexible to be eliminated through any approach currently available. What remains possible is reduction to a level where ecological and infrastructural damage is held within limits that human communities and native ecosystems can absorb. That requires coordinated nest destruction in high-density zones, sustained removal pressure across connected landscape units rather than isolated properties, urban design that reduces the habitat value of canal banks and landscaped waterfronts, and long-term monitoring that can detect population shifts before they become unmanageable surges. The real predator in this story isn't an animal. It's the accumulated weight of a landscape fighting back against something that was never supposed to be part of it. Fighting back through cold snaps and raccoons and owls and engineers reinforcing seawalls and researchers tracking nesting cycles with camera traps. That fight isn't dramatic. It doesn't produce a satisfying moment of resolution. But it is the actual shape of what ecological management looks like in a place where the damage is already done and the work is no longer about winning, but about not losing any more ground.